Welcome to episode 8 of the Pandemic Preparedness course here at BioDefense.com. My name is Mike Adams, the Health Ranger, the editor of nationalnews.com. I want to thank all of you for all of your incredible feedback on this course. I've heard from hundreds of people so far. I'm sure a lot more will come in. People are thankful that this course is free. They're thankful that I'm not pulling punches, and that I'm just laying it out like it is, and I'm giving people specific options to explore. And I've also heard a lot of thanks for our willingness to say the things that governments won't tell you and that the mainstream media won't report. I'm also really surprised to hear how many people are listening to this course from all over the world. And some of our listeners in Europe have mentioned how important it is for them to be able to get this course and listen to it, because this outbreak is likely to strike Europe before it reaches North America, just due to the geographic proximity with Africa. Obviously, West Africa, just head north up into Morocco and Spain, and then you're in Europe. So if this breaks containment in Africa, it's likely to end up either obviously in the Middle East, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on, or in Spain very quickly, and then could spread from there. Now let's start this episode with some rather shocking information. This just came out a few days ago. Lakeland Industries announces global availability of hazmat suits for Ebola. A U.S. company called Lakeland Industries, based out of New York, has said that the U.S. State Department put out a bid for 160,000 hazmat suits. And this company, Lakeland, says, quote, "We encourage all protective apparel companies to increase their manufacturing capacity for sealed seam garments so that our industry can do its part in addressing this threat to global health." They are, of course, referring to the Ebola outbreak. Now, the fact that the U.S. State Department has put out a bid for 160,000 Ebola hazmat suits, that should raise some eyebrows in even the most hardened skeptics out there. Clearly, the U.S. government is preparing for this pandemic to reach the United States. Think about it. You don't buy 160,000 hazmat suits to send to Africa, especially not when one of these countries, I think Sierra Leone, only has about 400 doctors left in the whole country. Most of them have either fled or have been killed by Ebola, unfortunately. So you don't send 160,000 suits to Africa if you're the U.S. State Department. There aren't simply enough people to even use them, to even deploy them. 160,000 Ebola hazmat suits can only have one purpose, and that is to be deployed in the United States of America. There's a lot more talk happening now, sort of behind the scenes, underground, word of mouth, that the big concern is that terror groups would be able to harvest Ebola off of the bodies of deceased victims, and then they would be able to smuggle that Ebola into Mexico City, releasing it there, knowing that if Ebola spread in Mexico City, it would very quickly spread across the southern border of the United States, which is wide open and completely unprotected. And in fact, for political reasons, the federal government has almost rolled out the red carpet for people to cross that border, but that's another discussion altogether. Nevertheless, the security of the southern border is almost non-existent, and as a result, this presents another vector of a huge threat to national security in the form of allowing infectious diseases to openly travel across this border. So terrorists don't even have to release this in a place like New York or Washington, D.C. or Chicago or wherever, whatever their targets might be. They don't even have to go into the United States. All they have to do is release it in Mexico City and let the self-replicating nature of the virus detonate its destructive potential, as the terrorists would want it to do. So the United States government is making all kinds of plans that the media is not telling you about, including this purchase of hazmat suits. Remember, there's one faction of the government that doesn't want to panic anybody. They don't want you to know what's going on because it might be too scary for many people. And perhaps that's true. A lot of people freak out when there's any discussion of actual reality. So maybe they're correct to keep us under wraps, but you and I don't have to be in the dark on this, and that's why I've recorded this pandemic preparedness course, and that's why you're listening, and I hope that's why you'll share this course. Just tell people to go to BioDefense.com, and they can hear the entire course free of charge, and they can download the audio files and share them with others. Everybody needs to know this. Now, if the U.S. government is preparing for a pandemic, doesn't it make sense that you should be too? I always find it interesting that when governments are engaged in preparedness, it's perceived as security. When individuals, however, engage in preparedness, it's always depicted as being something that's kooky or weird or nutso or whatever. It's a very malicious attempt out there to paint people who prepare as whack jobs. But I encourage you not to be dissuaded by that. That is simply the blueprint of the mainstream media trying to get as many people killed as possible during a pandemic by making sure the masses aren't prepared. Yes, I said that clearly. The mainstream media is trying to get as many people killed as possible. Remember, I already talked about the scientists that want to use genetically engineered viruses to kill off 25% of the human population. I already talked about Bill Gates hoping that vaccines could reduce the population by 10 to 15%. We've talked about this depopulation agenda out there. Well, one of the biggest ways to depopulate the world is to release a bioweapon. And I'm not saying that that's what's happening here. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. We don't have any proof of that yet. But this is one of the ways that is openly talked about by the sort of top globalists who want to depopulate the planet quite readily. And so they run the media, and they are making sure the media does not give people information that would save lives. Yes, it is extremely unethical on their part. Yes, it is highly irresponsible. Yes, it is possibly even anti-human. It is perhaps criminally negligent on the part of the media and health authorities and governments that who are not telling people the truth about what they need to be doing right now to prepare. Nevertheless, that is the plan of action they have taken because they want reduced population. That is their goal. So, how do they achieve that? Again, they withhold information that would save lives and then wait for a virus to be deployed either on purpose or accidentally or through natural mutations. They don't care how it starts as long as that virus burns through the world population and takes out some significant portion of the human population, then they're happy. So because the mainstream media has this deliberate withholding of life-saving, crucial information from the public, you are going to be dealing with the public that is almost completely unprepared. This is something that you got to get through your head. One of the biggest threats in a pandemic outbreak is going to be the population's response. Not even the virus itself, but the public's response to the crisis. Their sudden realization that they are completely unprepared and that they've been lied to, and now they're going to panic. You see, this gets down to the importance of the philosophy of preparedness. Now, I know there are some kind of left-leaning, liberal people out there who have said that preparedness is selfish. How dare you prepare? You're trying to hoard everything for yourself, and you're not planning on helping other people. Wow, I can't think of a better example of an insane idea than a leftist person thinking preparedness is bad. I guess in their view, everybody should be completely unprepared so that everybody is equally panicked. That's socialism. Everybody has to be equal all across the board. Well, people like that don't realize that those of us who do prepare, we reduce the burden on emergency responders. Because when we are prepared, and we have food and water and medicine and communications and self-defense means, then we do not become a problem. We're not panicked for all those supplies. We're not desperate. We are, in fact, helping towns and cities and especially rural areas reestablish order, reestablish the rule of law, and maintain public safety and encourage safe trade, which is absolutely crucial in recovery from any kind of a crisis situation. So those of us who do prepare are, in fact, community leaders. We're the ones who planned ahead. We are the innovators. We are the lifeguards of society, and we are the ones who will work with local law enforcement to rebuild the infrastructure of society, whether that's a safety or trade, like I mentioned, or distribution of medicine, or a barter system, free market system, all these kinds of things. We will help rebuild society. So preparing is, in fact, the smartest thing that you can do, which is exactly why governments always do it, even though they encourage the public not to do it. Currently in the United States, the federal government's official advice is that people should have a 3-day supply of food and water and other supplies. 3 days. That's as far as they're willing to go. Anything beyond 3 days would be, I guess, too radical. You know, I guess if you prepare for, here's the spectrum. This is what's so funny about it. If you don't prepare at all, even the government would say you're not being very smart. If you prepare for only 1 day, well, they're going to say that's inadequate. If you prepare for 3 days, they say that's perfect. If you prepare for 90 days, suddenly you're a kook. You see how that works? It's this spectrum which quickly ventures off into irrationality beyond the 3 days when they call you crazy or they call you a kook for having 10 days of supplies or 30 days or 2 years. Oh, gosh, only crazy people have 2 years. You know, that's the kind of thing that you see out there, which is, of course, just completely irrational attacks on community leaders who are, in fact, going to help save more people than anyone else. So this episode 8 is really about how to survive the population's response to the pandemic. The population will panic because they did not prepare. When the masses realize that they are not going to be able to go to the grocery store and buy food anytime they want, when they realize that maybe the tap water isn't working and they don't have any water, they're not collecting rainwater, they don't have a river or a stream to get water from, they may be very far from any body of water. When people realize that they're not going to be able to go get their prescription drugs at the pharmacy, and that they're not going to be able to call 911 and have police or ambulance or firefighters rush to their rescue, people will panic. They will panic. The way this will work is, first, the masses will be in a state of denial. The denial will last some period of time, at which point it will transition into panic. Panic creates desperation. And in a state of desperation, people become dangerous. This is why a lack of preparedness leads to social chaos and loss of life. This is why a lack of preparedness is a threat to national security, and it's why those of us who do prepare are, in fact, standing strong for a strong, secure nation and standing up for law enforcement and keeping our cities and towns in a relative state of peace and calm and safety. Because we are the ones who will not be out in the streets panicking, asking for water, as the masses will be. Now, if you want to look at examples of this, you don't have to go very far. Look at the way people put things off until the very last minute, and then they rush like a mob to go gather supplies. There were hurricanes in Hawaii over this summer, I guess it was 2 hurricanes back to back that struck the Big Island. Everybody panicked. In the 24 hours before the hurricane struck, they went to the grocery stores and they basically bought out everything possible. When Superstorm Sandy hit the eastern seaboard of the United States, in the day or two before, everybody panicked, went to the store, loaded up on supplies. When any hurricane, you take any hurricane that has struck America, including Hurricane Katrina that struck New Orleans several years back, people panicked at the last minute. They did not prepare in advance. They waited, and then they panicked. Now, the same thing will happen in a pandemic. People will panic. Supplies will be then impossible to get. You'll have to wait hours at a gas station just to buy some fuel at that point. Now, those of us who prepare in advance and live on farms, live in rural areas, normally we're sitting on top of hundreds or even thousands of gallons of diesel fuel at any given time. I think right now I've got at least 350 gallons of diesel fuel just a few hundred yards from where I'm doing this recording. That's enough diesel fuel to last many years and also power farm equipment for many hundreds of hours. But the average person won't do that. They may store 5 gallons or 10 gallons if they can get it. That's about it. It's not going to get them very far. In fact, in most major U.S. cities, it won't even get them out of the city. Because guess what happens when everybody tries to evacuate a major city all at once? There's a total logjam. Highways become parking lots. You can't get out, and you burn up all your gas idling or running your air conditioner trying to get out of town. So if you think about evacuating major U.S. cities like Houston, Texas, or like New York City, forget it. You can't evacuate New York City. It's impossible. Now, once people get through the phase of panic, they turn to desperation. Desperation is where all the politeness of society starts to break down. I challenge you to really, really ask yourself what you think you know about human nature. Right now you live in a society with enforced politeness. People don't just shoot each other in the streets and rob each other. Well, at least unless you're in Chicago or Detroit, I guess. But for the most part, people don't do that because there is the threat of police showing up. There is the threat of repercussions. And in many areas of the country, let's say upstate New York, people are polite to each other because they can be. They're not desperate. During normal times, they can always go to the grocery store. They can get food. They can get water. They can call 911 if they have an emergency. Everything's fine. So you can afford to be polite. When these systems break down, human nature comes out. Now, if you've never lived outside the United States, or if you've never lived in a war zone or a developing nation or gangland, then you don't know human nature. Human nature is inherently selfish and greed-driven, and in the right circumstances, almost everyone will lose their cool, and they will become animalistic in their behavior. This can very quickly happen in times of threatened starvation, or when people fear that they may not live or that their children may not be able to live unless they acquire some food or water or medicine by any means necessary. Human politeness goes out the window very quickly in a crisis, and it gets replaced with human nature, which can be very, very destructive and heartless. Now, I'm going to discuss self-defense, family defense, community defense, and, of course, firearms. And knowing that this is somewhat of a sensitive topic, I'd like to start it in this way. In society, in a normal, peaceful, orderly type of society, all of us agree to delegate certain responsibilities to specialists. Now, for example, let's take your local fire department. Back before there were fire departments, every person was responsible for putting out their own fires. And maybe they would get the help of neighbors, hopefully. But if they lived out in the country, far away from anybody, and there was a fire, they would have to put out their own fire or just watch it burn down. Fire departments were created as a way for communities to delegate the specialty task of fire suppression to a group of individuals who would take on that task from the population, thereby alleviate the population of having to learn how to be firefighters, which, let's face it, is a special task requiring young, strong men, usually, who are willing to take risks and who have a lot of special training. So we created fire departments for that purpose. We have hospitals for much the same purpose, because there is a segment of society that is specialists who specialize in emergency medicine, doctors, nurses, support staff, radiologists, anesthesiologists, and so on. So we give them this role, and then we delegate that away from ourselves, so we don't have to become doctors. We don't have to learn how to operate x-ray machines or perform emergency surgery on someone suffering from a gunshot wound. We delegate those things. Police are the same. police and sheriffs, we as a society have delegated the responsibility of personal protection, personal defense, to a special group of people who are trained in a specific skill set. Those people are called police or sheriff's deputies and so on. These people have a special skill set which involves, by the way, it actually centers around the use of guns. If you dialed 911 and called police and they showed up without guns, you would think that they're being negligent. It is, in fact, the gun that gives police the ability to carry out their special job in the same way that a fire hose, a water hose, allows a fireman to put out a fire. A police officer or sheriff uses a firearm in order to put out the violence, so to speak, to stop violence. And this is why I'm always shocked that some people who are philosophically opposed to guns, for whatever reason, they absolutely insist that when they call 911, men with guns show up at their house, because they have delegated this responsibility of knowing how to use a firearm and knowing how to deploy a firearm to this specialty group of people who are, in fact, well trained in the use of firearms in the same way that firemen or firewomen, I guess, they're mostly men, are specially trained in the use of fire suppression. So, what happens? This is the question to you. What happens in a collapse scenario? Whether we're talking about a pandemic collapse, or we're talking about a grid down scenario, a solar flare, an EMP attack, a nuclear war, riots, earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, you name it. What happens? What happens is that the delegation of responsibilities that you have undertaken to delegate to fire departments and police departments and hospitals and even farmers and so on, that delegation also collapses. All of a sudden, all these responsibilities that you have granted to someone else or you have depended on someone else to cover, all of a sudden those groups can't cover those responsibilities anymore. The responsibility now falls back onto you. This is, in fact, the essence of preparedness. Why do you store food and store seeds and plan to grow food? Because you assume, correctly, that the farmer specialty group is not going to be able to help you anymore. That delegation collapses back to you. You're going to have to feed yourself. Why do people have firearms for preparedness? Because they understand that that delegation of self-defense that they normally might delegate to dialing 911 and hoping the police show up, that is also collapsing back onto them. Now they are responsible for their own personal protection, their own self-defense, family defense, and even property defense. And in many states, like the state of Texas, by the way, it is perfectly legal to use a firearm in defense of your property. You can use a firearm to stop any person who is engaged in the commission of a felony crime under Texas law. So even if someone, let's say you wake up in the middle of the night, someone is breaking into your car and stealing your radio, you can legally shoot that person in the state of Texas because they are committing a felony crime. Now, you better make sure that you know they're committing a felony crime, and you will also have to deal with a potential civil lawsuit, but you won't face criminal charges for that act because it is protected under Texas law. Now, in a pandemic outbreak scenario, which I'm generally referring to as a collapse scenario, you're going to have extreme lawlessness in high population centers, cities for the most part. Even today, right now, in places like Detroit, the crime is so bad and the police are so underfunded and understaffed that Detroit police openly announce and encourage citizens to, quote, buy a gun if you want to defend yourself. And the Detroit police have also publicly announced that they will no longer respond to anything less than a felony crime such as a homicide. So in essence, these police forces have already publicly said that their ability to handle your delegation of personal protection is in a state of collapse. And this is even in a normal, peaceful time. There's not even a crisis happening right now, and they still can't protect you. Now, in many places, especially the big cities, by the way, the police response time is getting longer and longer. Most cities in the United States are losing money. Many are on the verge of bankruptcy. Some have already declared bankruptcy. Because of these budget limitations, we are seeing cuts in police forces and sometimes fire and other emergency services. In many cities now, there are hundreds or thousands of police officer positions that are not being filled due to budgetary restraints. This is why when you have riots in places like Ferguson, Missouri, as we saw in the summer of 2014, the police were vastly outnumbered, and they really couldn't do anything except stand around and just try to prevent the whole riot situation from escalating even more, but they certainly couldn't stop the riots. In most places now, the rioters outnumber the police, and again, this is in peacetime. What do you think is going to happen if you have a pandemic that sweeps through major U.S. cities, and then you have shortages of food, water, fuel, medicine? Hospital beds aren't available because they're all full. What do you think is going to happen in that case? Well, you're going to have 100 times as many people possibly in the streets, looting, looking for food, possibly rioting. Well, I don't even have to use the word possibly. It's an absolute definite certainty. They're going to loot every retail store that they can reach, every single one of them. Every Walmart, every 7-Eleven, every grocery store will be completely and utterly looted in any area where there is a large number of people who become desperate. You can absolutely count on that. In fact, as we saw after Hurricane Katrina, the police will join in with the looting. Remember those video images of police looting the Walmart stores in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina? Yeah, the cops were in there taking what they needed too. So don't think for a minute that the police are going to be able to handle the responsibility that you have delegated to them, that we have delegated to them. And as much as law enforcement people, police are normally good people. They have good intentions, especially local police. They want to create a safe society. Now, there's only a few bad cops. I mean, I know there are horror stories of cops gone crazy, power-hungry cops, whatever. But that's the minority. Most cops are actually people who want to help their local communities, and they want to create peace. They want to maintain order. They want to protect innocent people from bad guys. Despite their best efforts, however, they will be unable to protect you in a sufficiently large collapse or public desperation scenario. And so I know I've spent quite a bit of time explaining this, but the point is that this responsibility will now revert back to you. Now, once that reverts to you, how are you going to defend yourself? How are you going to defend your family? Possibly defend your neighborhood or your community, maybe even your church? How are you going to defend your supplies? The food, the water, the medicine, the things that you have stockpiled, and perhaps you were willing to share those with others, but you can't share with the whole world. You don't have enough stuff, so you're going to have to protect that in order for it to be of use to you and anybody else that you want to share it with. How are you going to protect yourself? Now, what's interesting is that police departments all across the country and around the world have all unanimously chosen one weapon to accomplish this defense. That weapon is the firearm, the pistol, in most cases, sometimes rifles, but usually pistols. Why does every police officer on the street carry a pistol? The answer is because it is the single most effective tool for stopping violence. It stops it through kinetic action. You have to understand the role of the firearm in a peaceful society. There may be people in a society who are trying to commit violence or threaten violence against others in order to steal their property or to cause them harm or kidnap them or whatever. If talking to people was enough to stop them, then police officers would never need guns. They could just talk to people and say, halt, stop, do not proceed. Unfortunately, words alone do not stop people who have ill intent. And hopefully this point is obvious by now. You have to physically stop them. How do you physically stop them? Well, again, the firearm is the number one choice of police departments all over the world for precisely this reason. It is able to halt a violent aggressor very rapidly and, most importantly, at a distance. Guns work remotely in essence. You don't have to be touching that person in order to stop them. Furthermore, guns are the great equalizer. A gun in the hand of a 72-year-old granny is just as effective at stopping a bad guy as a gun in the hand of a 29-year-old UFC fighter. That gun makes them both equal in terms of being able to deal out kinetic force that will stop an aggressor, stop a violent person, or stop a crime from being committed. This is why guns create peace, and that's why cops carry them, because cops are in the business of creating peace, not escalating violence. And that's also why cops are trained of when or when not to use firearms. Cops are trained, and I've trained with cops, by the way, extensively, and I was a board member of a nonprofit for local law enforcement, a police department in Arizona. So I've worked with a lot of cops. They are trained to de-escalate violence. And they do that by making sure that the firearm is a last resort and only invoked in the case of a last-ditch tool to stop immediate violence. In fact, it's what a lot of people don't know is that a member of the public actually has more legal leeway to use a firearm than a police officer. A police officer is put under far more scrutiny if they use their gun than a member of the general public. A lot of people don't know that. They think cops are just gunslingers who just shoot everybody. No, that's only New York cops. But the rest of the cops in the country actually are very restrained in their use of firearms because they know if there's a shooting, there's an investigation, they have to turn in their gun, they may be put on a desk job for a long period of time, they may face civil liability. Lots of reasons to not use a gun unless you absolutely need to. Whereas a member of the public may tend to use it more quickly, especially if they're in their own home, they're on their own property, someone is breaking in, then they actually have a very broad legal standing in most states to be able to fire that weapon in self-defense on their own property. The laws change if they're out in public, of course, but on their own property, they have a lot of legal leeway. But the point here is that both cops and homeowners use guns for the same reason, to stop violence. To stop violence. So when it comes to you deciding whether or not you wish to use a firearm in your own self-defense, the only really relevant question is, do I wish to have a tool to stop violence? That's what a gun is for in this context. Now, obviously, you should abide by your local laws. I'm not advocating you to go to an illegal gun dealer and illegally possess a gun. Let's say if you're in New York City, it's against the law for you to own a gun, except under very special permits, or if you're a cop, for example. In a lot of countries, it's also very, very illegal for you to own a gun as a private citizen. So I'm not saying violate the laws. What I'm saying is, if it's legal for you to own a firearm in your area, you may wish to own a firearm and become proficient in it, even if you hate guns, even if you hate violence, because guns are used by police and homeowners to stop violence. That is the purpose of that tool. And to bring it back around full circle to what I mentioned when I opened this segment, remember that your ability to call a group of specialists who you have delegated defense to, that is local police, dialing 911, your ability to do that will likely disappear. It will be gone in most collapse scenarios, including potentially a pandemic that shuts down a lot of the infrastructure. What if half the police force is infected with Ebola? Right there, you have a situation for social chaos. It's not going to be a pretty situation. So I'm not saying that you should love guns or be a gun collector or that you should worship them or anything like that. Just that you should use them as a tool in the same way that you would use a solar panel as a tool to collect electricity to help in your survival. That you have a lot of tools around to help in your survival. You have a flashlight so you can see at night, a useful tool. A pistol, especially a Glock 19, is a really, really useful firearm that has a specific tool to help in your defense. So regardless of your political leanings or your feelings on violence, if you wish to stop violence, this is the single most effective tool which has been unanimously chosen as the world's most effective tool by almost every police department in the world. It's called a Glock. And the 9mm is the number one choice. And the Glock 19 is probably the single best firearm that you could ever own for purposes of self-defense at the pistol level. If you go into shotguns, that's a whole different discussion. I'm not going to get into that, except to say that I recommend for most people who are new to firearms, get yourself a 20-gauge shotgun because it's much smaller, lighter, easier to handle than a 12-gauge. A 12-gauge is built for big guys, usually. A 20-gauge is just as useful for home defense, but is a lot easier to handle, a lot easier to control, and thus can be deployed more safely on your part. Now, one of the last points I'm going to make in this section is the fact that having a firearm makes your words count more for some mysterious reason. For example, let's say you're in your house, you're in a neighborhood. All your neighbors know that you are sitting on stockpiles of stored food, water, and medicine because, well, you made the mistake of alerting the whole neighborhood to this fact before the pandemic arrived. Now, they're starving, they're hungry. You're going to help people as much as you can, but you can't help everybody because you don't have an unlimited supply and you don't own a giant underground bunker cave like the federal government does. So you have to protect your supplies in order to protect your family, even when you're sharing what you can, right? So here's a scenario. 5 neighbors come to your door. They knock on your door, you answer the door, and they say, "Hey, we are starving over here. Our children are starving. We noticed your children are well fed. And we think that because we're all neighbors, your food should be evenly distributed among all of us." Now, here are the two possible things, the answers that you have. Answer number one is you, without a gun, saying, "Sorry, these are supplies that I purchased, that I prepared well in advance. I'm sharing what I can, but I can't feed the whole neighborhood. Thank you and goodbye." That's scenario one. Scenario number two is the exact same thing, except now you have a Glock on your hip, and you make sure that your neighbors can see that Glock. So you're saying the exact same words, but now you have a firearm on your hip. Your neighbors realize that you are armed. Which of these two options do you think is going to be more effective at protecting you from the potential of being robbed or looted by some of your neighbors? The answer is version 2, obviously. Now you have a firearm. They know that you have the ability to protect yourself. Now, it doesn't mean that you are threatening violence against anyone. In fact, quite the contrary. You are in favor of keeping the peace. You are in favor of supporting as many people as you can. You're probably sharing some supplies. You're donating some supplies. You're helping out, especially children, wherever you can. But you now have a firearm to make sure that you maintain some of the stockpiles that you put in place so that you can continue to serve that leadership role in the community of helping others as you so choose. Whereas if you didn't have a firearm, you could easily be overrun and looted. And believe me, there are a lot of people out there, and they're called socialists or liberals, who always think that your stuff is their property. They think that when they have nothing, they're supposed to confiscate it from people like you who have prepared in advance and thereby equally distribute it. This is called socialism or communism, or basically just being a leftist, okay? And these people will think absolutely nothing of having the local police department come in with guns to take your stuff, and then they will call it equality. Don't be surprised if that happens. This is why, of course, you need to have other strategies to protect and even hide some of your stuff so that you don't get looted out and end up desperate just like everybody else because someone took all your stuff. And that someone could be FEMA, by the way. Don't forget that Obama has the executive order in place to confiscate lawfully, under federal law. They can confiscate all food, all medicine, all water, even seeds, livestock, farm equipment, tractors, fuel, everything. That's already on the books. So they can come take it. And if you I don't know, maybe some people would be willing to give up everything that's keeping them alive because they want to be obedient to to that system. But I think most folks out there would like to hide some stuff so that they have a chance at survival. Now, the last point here in this section, and then I'll wrap this up, is that you need to remember there's strength in numbers. If you're out there living by yourself right now, or if you are up there in your years and you're not able to physically defend yourself in the same way that someone might be if they're in their 20s or 30s, you would be really wise to plan in advance to be part of a group. And often this is a family group. So you and your family members might decide in advance, we're all going to go here. We're going to go to Grandpa's cabin in the woods, or whatever, Uncle Bob's ranch. Whatever the place is, it should obviously be a place out in the country. The farther away from the city, the better. And that's why it's a great idea to have some of your supplies stored out there at Uncle Bob's ranch, and probably hidden there just in case there are looters or thieves running around out there. The point is, if you are by yourself, you can't keep watch. You're going to have to sleep sooner or later, right? So you need to be able to be part of a group so that you can begin to delegate the watch task and take turns watching for your group safety. That's why really the smallest group you want to be part of is probably 4 people. It'd be better to have 6 to 8. If you get above 20, it might start to get a little too many, but a group size of about 6 to 8 people is really ideal for riding out a scenario like this. You can help each other serve for protection and defense and so on. Some people can be cooking the meals while others are on watch, or doing a patrol even, or just using a pair of binoculars to keep an eye on the surroundings, whatever the case may be. So think about groups. Maybe you have a family group. Maybe you have a group of friends that you're really close to. Maybe you have a church group. Maybe you have some other hobby group that you're part of. Whatever the case may be, find a group and have a talk about this. It's no longer outside of the realm of possibility that there's going to be an Ebola pandemic sweeping across the United States. You can have that conversation with them. And you can explain to them, hey, you know what? The CDC has issued alerts to U.S. hospitals all across the country to say, be prepared for the pandemic. Or, hey, the U.S. State Department ordered 160,000 hazmat suits for the Ebola outbreak. You can talk about the government preparing, so shouldn't we have a conversation about basic preparedness? And if so, wouldn't we be stronger in a group? Shouldn't we combine our forces and in a small scale, 6 to 8 people, maybe 10, or even as few as 4? And shouldn't we work together to make it through this so that we can one day get back to our lives? There is strength in numbers. And you would do well to remember that, especially in light of this episode here at BioDefense.com, which is focused on surviving the public's response to the pandemic and the loss of critical services. So in summary, remember that there are really 2 basic threats. One threat, well, I guess there are 3 actually. One threat is the virus itself. The second threat is the public's response to the loss of services, the loss of infrastructure. And then the third threat, which actually could help you or could be a threat to you depending on where you are and what's going on, is the government itself. Local government will tend to be very helpful. Federal government could go either way. If they invoke executive orders and martial law, then they could run around with armed FEMA agents and DHS goons with guns running around confiscating all your stuff, and that would put them in the bad category, obviously. But if their response is limited to helping deliver water and food and medicine, then they could be helpful. So we don't know which way they're going to go, but one thing that concerns me and that concerns a great many people in this country today is how Obama has created an executive private army, which is the DHS. And how DHS, I don't know if you remember, 2 years ago we were reporting on DHS purchasing about 2 billion rounds of ammunition. DHS. They were buying 223, 556. They were buying 7.62 rounds or 308 Winchester. They were buying long-range sniper rounds, shotgun rounds, and handgun rounds by the billions in aggregate. And the mainstream media, I remember specifically when we first reported this story, the mainstream media said, oh, no, that's not true. That's a conspiracy theory. DHS isn't buying 2 billion rounds of ammo. And then when we and other alternative news organizations actually pointed out, showed the federal bid number and all the text in there that outlined exactly what they were buying, and then it was irrefutable, then the mainstream media said, oh, well, yeah, they are buying those rounds, but they're just for practice. So, yeah, who needs 2 billion rounds of ammunition for practice? Nobody. So it's clear that DHS has been arming up, and it is increasingly militarized, and it has been expanding in force, and it is entirely unconstitutional. We are not supposed to have a standing army on U.S. soil, and especially not an army run by the president, the executive branch of government. The only military we are supposed to have under the Constitution is a military that defends and protects our borders, our shores, our country, which is under the authority of Congress, not the executive branch. There is a very good reason why our country's founders made sure that the executive branch of government did not have the power to control its own private army. There are lessons about that throughout history, the history of Rome, the history of Nazi Germany. Just almost every war in history came from some kind of a concentration of power in the hands of bad government. And that's why our country was set up this way, to make sure that the executive branch did not have its own private army. And yet, quietly, covertly, that's what Obama has now created, is a private army called DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. Well, I guess Bush actually started that, and then Obama simply expanded it. So you see, it doesn't matter what party these people are from. They're all in favor of having their own private government army that they command and control. So that's something that has a lot of people concerned, but we'll have to see how it actually plays out. Nevertheless, be sure to share this audio. Feel free to put it on torrent websites. Tell other people about this website. The site is BioDefense.com. My name is Mike Adams. I'm the Health Ranger, the editor of NaturalNews.com. And this program is fully funded. That's why we're releasing it all for free, by your support of the Natural News Store. Please go there. If you'd like to support us, everything we sell is laboratory tested for heavy metals to make sure that we don't sell anything with high levels of heavy metals. Everything is validated before we sell it. The web address is store.naturalnews.com. Store.naturalnews.com. Thank you for your support.